They conquered half the Mediterranean world, without making bowmen the backbone of their armies. Sounds absurd, right? Especially when you remember the Parthians, Sarmatians, Cretans, Syrians, and a dozen other neighbors who lived and died by their bows. So why did Rome, whose military thinking was otherwise so pragmatic, largely shun archery as a core Roman specialty? The answer isn't one thing. It's a knot of doctrine, culture, kit, logistics, and inconvenient technology, stitched together by a society that prized close combat and standardized everything that moved. Start with the core of the Roman fighting machine. Picture a legionary at dawn, scutum propped against the tent, a pilum slung on his shoulder, the short gladius at his side. That was not an accident of fashion. The gladius and scutum were optimized for one task, closing with an enemy and finishing him with a short, brutal thrust. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, was designed not to kill at range so much as to ruin the enemy's shield and formation before the lines met. Roman training baked this choreography into soldiers until it was reflex. March in step, throw the pilum to break shields, close ranks, thrust with the gladius, and keep the lines intact. Discipline and repetition mattered more than individual marksmanship. You needed men who would stand shoulder to shoulder and follow orders when the enemy's javelins were raining down. That doctrinal setup made archery feel, at best, peripheral, and at worst, a threat to the very formation that made Rome powerful. Consider what the standard Roman load looked like. Between armor, shield, weapons, rations, tools for building a camp every night, and the gear for long marches, a legionary carried a lot. The scutum was large and curved, perfect for forming a mobile wall, terrible for someone who needs a free right arm and a clear line of sight to draw and loose a heavy bow. Added the pilum. This tool load filled the soldiers' tempo and tasks. Roman operations relied on men who could march all day, dig camps at night, and grip a shield in phalanx-like discipline. Bows, especially powerful ones, demanded different ergonomics, different training, and different loadouts. You do not simply bolt archery onto a formation optimized to fight at arm's length and expect miracles. So why not make archers out of a subset of recruits? Why not let some men carry bows and others carry shields? Rome did do that sometimes, but there were practical ripples. A mixed unit requires different tactics, loose order skirmishing, dispersed formations, and commanders comfortable with flexible battlefield geometry. Those techniques conflicted with the legionary emphasis on cohesion, rotation, and mutual support. Rome's success owed a lot to a standard, reliable package. Specializing units, especially in an army built for conquest and occupying cities, introduced complexity the commanders often judged unnecessary. Standardization reduced uncertainty in logistics, supply, and command. It worked for a very long time. Now add the cultural ingredient, arguably the most delicate, status. Roman elite culture valorized the face-to-face commander. Scars from hand-to-hand fighting were social currency. Political careers were built on visible exploits, a broken spear, a captured standard, prisoners taken in close combat. The cursus honorum, the ladder of public office, favored personal valor and the spectacle of bravery. Archery, across much of the Roman elite's imagination, belonged to hunting, to lower-status militia, or to foreign mercenaries. It lacked the glamour of a legionary command. That social stigma discouraged the development of a widespread native military tradition around the bow. If your political reward system prizes being up close and visible, why train and promote men whose best work happens at a distance and is less spectacular for public audiences? Greek cultural models didn't help. The elite of Rome admired many things Greek: philosophy, oratory, aesthetics. Greek literary and military images often associated the heroic man with personal combat. Think Homeric scenes where a warrior seeks glory by closing with his foe. That legacy bled into Roman expectations of virtue and martial honor. The result? Archery acquired a tarnished association in elite circles. It became, in many discussions, a specialist skill better outsourced than mainstreamed. But this was not simply pride or performance art. Technology and material culture weighed heavily. The kinds of bows that beat Romans on occasion, composite recurve bows used by Parthian and later steppe horse archers, were technological products requiring materials and craftsmanship that weren't common in Italy. Composite bows combined wood, horn, sinew and glue under precise lamination and long curing processes. Skilled artisans and systems to make and repair bows at scale were necessary. Those artisans and the cultural ecosystem that produced mounted archers were mainly located in the east and on the Eurasian steppe. In other words, to get really good archers, you needed a way of life, not just a training manual. Even the simpler alternative, a long, strong self-bow, faces material limits. The famous English longbow drew on yew, a timber not abundant in Italy. Where suitable timber was scarce, you leaned on composites or imports. Building a corps of competent archers meant either importing bows and craftsmen or building a domestic industry that took decades to mature. In wartime, the Romans often found it easier, faster, and cheaper to hire specialists or recruit provincials already expert in archery than to recreate that embedded cultural skill. Training adds another layer. Accuracy and effectiveness with the bow, especially on horseback, are not skills you can teach in a few months. They form in a childhood of riding, hunting, and constant practice. A culture raised on horseback will produce thousands of competent mounted archers as a matter of course. A sedentary culture that emphasizes drill and discipline will not. Rome could and did train good archers when needed, but scaling that skill to the level where it became a pillar of legionary identity would have required a generational shift in recruitment and upbringing. That's something the Roman state was often unwilling or unable to do on a large scale. Then there's logistics in the field. Arrows mean quivers, spare strings, repair kits, and a supply chain, especially problematic for campaigns deep in hostile territory. A legion marched with a train. Add thousands of arrows and bows and your baggage train grows. Ammunition resupply becomes a real tactical consideration. In prolonged fights, archers are only as good as their quivers. Roman doctrine preferred troops whose performance relied less on fragile, consumable stores and more on durable equipment and discipline. A thrown pilum is a one-shot investment that directly disrupts enemy defenses. A bow requires sustained supply. All of this helps explain why Rome outsourced missile power. From early on, the legions were a coalition of armaments. The heavy infantry corps surrounded by specialists, auxiliaries, who supplied skills Rome did not cultivate at home. Cretan archers, Syrian slingers, and Numidian light cavalry appear repeatedly in Roman records and iconography. These troops were provincials or allied peoples renowned for particular skills. Rome integrated them as auxiliaries. They fought in Roman campaigns, often for decades, and many received citizenship upon honorable discharge. The system made sense. Hire the expertise, pay less than it costs to cultivate the skill domestically, and retain the core doctrine that worked so reliably. The worst example of Rome's blind spot, and the one history points to most dramatically, is Carrhae in 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus led an expedition into Parthian territory that ended in disaster. The Parthians, masters of mounted archery, used mobile tactics that the Roman heavy infantry found infuriating and lethal. Horse archers would approach, loosed clouds of arrows, and melt back before the Roman lines could make contact. The Romans could not force a decisive close fight on favorable terms. Crassus attempted to pursue and to force hand-to-hand engagements, but the terrain, Parthian mobility, and the psychological pressure of rain-like projectiles repeatedly thwarted him. The result was catastrophe for the Roman detachment. Archery crystallized a painful lesson. Roman tactics were excellent in many contexts, but not universally so. Meeting an army whose primary weapon was mobility plus assailing missile fire exposed a glaring strategic vulnerability. What makes Archery more instructive is Rome's reaction. Instead of a wholesale pivot, the response was incremental. Roman commanders incorporated more auxiliary archers, experimented with combined arms tactics, and approached eastern campaigns with more caution. But they didn't rip up the legionary rulebook. Why? Because the system that had built Rome's empire was still, on balance, enormously successful. The benefits of a standardized, disciplined heavy infantry force trumped the need to re-engineer core identity after a single, if spectacular, defeat. There are costs to radical institutional change, costs in logistics, training, political symbolism, and battlefield predictability. Rome preferred adaptation by integration rather than by transformation. So Rome did what powerful states often do. It outsourced. Provincial archers, mercenaries, and allied peoples filled the missile niche. Cretan archers in particular acquired a reputation for excellence in the Mediterranean world. Syrian archers and other eastern specialists also fought extensively for Roman commanders. Numidian light cavalry excelled at swift, skirmishing tasks. But this outsourcing had consequences. These specialists were often seen as auxiliaries in the literal sense, an adjunct to the Roman corps. They could be indispensable in battle and remain second-class politically. That arrangement worked militarily, but it allowed, and perhaps encouraged, a cultural separation. Archery remained identified, in many military and civic minds, with the periphery rather than the Roman heart. Technological and production realities deepened the separation. Composite bows are fragile little miracles of engineering. An expert bowyer might take weeks or months to make a single quality composite bow, and the materials, good horn, sinew, and a stable supply of strong glues, weren't manufactured in the same way all across Italy. Repairing bows and replacing strings required local skills. You can't sustain mounted archery effectively when every campaign leaves you hunting for bowyers and replacement sinew. That logistical brittleness pushed commanders toward more robust, less maintenance-heavy arms. This is not to say Rome never used archers. It did, often and effectively. But these archers were frequently non-Roman by origin, and they operated within a broader strategy that still privileged the legionary corps. When Rome fought on terrain favorable to missile troops, rough, broken ground, or wide-open steppe, it adapted. But the Mediterranean theater, where legions typically operated, often rewarded the Roman approach. The geography of the empire validated the doctrine, and doctrine reinforced culture, creating a feedback loop resistant to wholesale change. There's a further nuance: political incentives. Triumphs and honors were public, theatrical events. The spectacle of victory was more convincing when leaders and elite soldiers were visibly triumphant. Captives paraded by hand, standards recovered in melee, wounds displayed as proof of valor. An accomplished archer's best feats, hits from afar, were rarely as dramatic for the Roman crowd. The civic ladder therefore nudged officers and nobles toward valor in obvious proximate combat. Where incentives shape behavior, institutions conform. Rome's political and social systems quietly pushed military evolution down particular paths. But the story doesn't end with stubbornness. History is rarely a straight line. As the centuries rolled on and pressures shifted, new enemies from different environments, changing technologies, and recruitment imperatives, Rome adapted. By the late empire, the composition of Roman forces looked markedly different from the Republican legions of the early 1st centuries BC. Emperors like Diocletian restructured the military, and later the frontier armies included more cavalry and more specialized missile troops, often recruited from the very peoples Rome had once labeled barbarian. The Notitia Dignitatum, A late Roman administrative document lists many units with names suggesting mounted archers and Eastern origins. The foederati system and increased reliance on recruited frontier peoples brought horse archers, composite bows, and mounted skirmishing tactics into the imperial fold. The irony is palpable. The techniques and peoples once distrusted for their different style of warfare became essential to the empire's later defenses. This irony has consequences. Outsourcing expertise produces short-term gains and long-term dependencies. By the time Rome leaned heavily on recruited archers and foederati cavalry, it had lost some of the internal capacity to produce them at scale. Recruiting foreigners in large numbers could secure immediate battlefield capacity, but also shifted political and social dynamics. Soldiers once marginally tolerated became crucial players in defense and, at times, political power brokering. That's not to say Rome fell because of archers. Decline, where it happened, was complex and multi-causal. But reliance on externalized skills altered military culture and, over time, the state's options. There's also the matter of perception versus reality. Some modern tales reduce the Roman avoidance of archery to simple arrogance or stubborn stupidity. That's tempting, dramatic, and often wrong. The Roman approach had deep rationales. Standardized heavy infantry minimized individual variation, simplified command, and made supply predictable. It fit Roman society's norms and its political economy. It was a model that paid enormous dividends in conquest, colonial administration, and siege warfare. The flip side is that every model has its blind spots. Rome's system was superb in certain geographies and political contexts, and vulnerable in others, especially against highly mobile, missile-heavy opponents. Where did that leave commanders? Practical men like Caesar, Trajan, or Hadrian were often flexible pragmatists. In campaigns east of the Euphrates or against mounted peoples, Roman generals increased use of local auxiliaries and adapted tactics accordingly. They built fortifications, experimented with cavalry support, and used combined arms approaches when necessary. But commanders also operate under political constraints. A general who abandons the legionary ideal risks his reputation, his career, and the trust of his soldiers. So change tended to be incremental. Recruit foreign archers, modify tactics where needed, but keep the legion as the centerpiece. We should pause on one more technical point, the interaction between shield design and missile use. The Roman scutum is a powerful defensive tool. Its curvature lets soldiers interlock shields, forming an almost continuous surface for protection against spear and sword. That geometry is great for defense and for providing a stable platform to strike from. It's not friendly to archery. A soldier trying to draw a powerful bow needs a clear right arm motion and space to orient his body. Within a shield wall, that motion is constrained. That structural incompatibility meant that if Rome had adopted bow tactics wholesale, the scutum and the gladius would likely have to be redesigned or rethought. Another institutional shift with cascading logistics and training costs. Returning to Carhae. The lesson the Romans learned was the value of mobility and missile craftsmanship that was not native to Rome. They reacted by adding auxiliaries, fortifying supply lines, and exercising more politicking in eastern campaigns. Yet, Rome's core preference for close combat persisted for centuries. Even when emperors later embraced heavy cavalry, clipped as cataphracts, and sought mounted archers, these additions were accommodated alongside, not instead of, the legion's legacy. That mixed bag approach gave Rome flexibility, but also created internal tensions. Training for multiple specializations is expensive and demanding. Balancing those demands was a perpetual administrative headache. The final irony reverberates across centuries. Rome's strength and pride in discipline, uniformity, and close combat valor built an empire, but also imposed blind spots that cost dearly in the wrong encounter. The shocking truth in the title is not that Romans were cowards or stupid. It's that a coherent cultural and military system, one that produced spectacular success, also engineered vulnerabilities. Doctrine, equipment, social values, and logistical realities conspired to make archery a foreign art for Rome. When the world shifted, Rome adapted, but only slowly, and often by turning to the very peoples and techniques it had earlier relegated to the periphery. So what's the modern takeaway? Strategic choices are cultural as much as tactical. Institutions tend to preserve the practices that reward them. Rome's avoidance of a homegrown archery tradition was not accidental. It was a rational outcome of values, incentives, and material realities. That calculus won battles and built infrastructure for centuries, and it occasionally lost spectacularly when it met an adversary whose tactics exploited Rome's particular blind spot. If you enjoy deep dives like this, where strategy, culture, and technology tangle in unexpected ways, subscribe for more. You'll get the next episode where we trace how late Roman armies reorganized around cavalry and archery, and how that shift reshaped the empire's military culture. To sum up, Rome's reluctance to make archery a central Roman craft was a multi-layered choice. Doctrinally, the legion favored closing and formation integrity. Culturally, honor and spectacle rewarded hand-to-hand valor. Logistically, bows demanded materials, craftsmen, and supply lines that were foreign to Italy. And technically, certain bows required generations of specialized practice to use well. The result was a military system that outsourced missile power, adapted around specialists, and only slowly integrated the very things it had once discounted. That mixture of prudence and pride made Rome both a conqueror and, when circumstances demanded different tools, a vulnerable one. If this unpacking left you wanting the sources and a deeper bibliography, check the description for recommended reading. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the deep dive. And pass this on to someone who thinks Rome was just rigid and wrong. It was rigid, yes. It was wrong in some fights, certainly. But most of the time that rigidity was a deliberate, costly, and effective choice. And that complexity is the real shock.